Chapter 1. The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger came early one winter's day in February, through a biting wind and the last snowfall of the year. He walked over the hill from Bramblehurst station and carried a little black bag in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the edge of his soft grey hat hid every part of his face except the shiny point of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest. He almost fell into the coach and horses, more dead than alive, and threw his bag down. "A fire!" he cried. "In the name of human kindness! A room and a fire!" He stamped his feet, shook the snow from his coat, and followed Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper's wife, into her parlour. There he arranged to take a room in the inn, and gave her £2. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left him there while she went to prepare him a meal with her own hands. To have a guest at Iping in the winter-time was an unusual piece of good fortune, and she was determined to show that she deserved it. She put some meat on the fire to cook, told Milly, the servant, to get the room ready for the stranger, and carried the cloth, plates and glasses into the parlour, and began to lay the table. Although the fire was burning brightly, she was surprised to see that her visitor still wore his hat and coat, and stood with his back to her, looking out of the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were held behind him, and he seemed to be thinking deeply. She noticed that some melted snow was falling onto the floor from his shoulders. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said, "and dry them in the kitchen?" "No," he replied, without turning. She was not sure that she had heard him, and was about to repeat the question. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "I would rather keep them on," he said firmly, and she noticed that he wore big blue glasses and had a bushy beard over his coat collar that almost hid his face. "Very well, sir," she said, "as you like. Very soon the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and turned his face away from her again, and Mrs. Hall, feeling that her talk was unwelcome, finished laying the table quickly and hurried out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there like a man of stone, his collar turned up, the edge of his hat turned down, almost hiding his face and ears. She put down the eggs and meat noisily, and called rather than said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he answered. He did not move until she was closing the door. Then he turned round and walked eagerly up to the table. Mrs. Hall filled the butter dish in the kitchen and took it to the parlour. She knocked and entered at once. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she only saw something white disappearing behind the table. He seemed to be picking up something from the floor. She put down the butter dish on the table and noticed that the visitor's hat and coat were hanging over a chair in front of the fire. "I suppose I may have them to dry now," she said, in a voice that could not be refused. "Leave the hat," said her visitor, and turning, she saw he had raised his head and was looking at her. For a moment she stood looking at him, too surprised to speak. He held his napkin over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaws were completely hidden. But it was not that which surprised Mrs. Hall. It was the fact that the top of his head, above his blue glasses, was covered by a white bandage, and that another covered his ears, leaving nothing of his face to be seen except his pink, pointed nose. It was bright pink and shining, just as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown jacket, with a high black collar turned up about his neck. His thick black hair stuck out below and between the bandages. This bandaged head was so unlike what she had expected that for a moment she stood staring at it. He did not remove the napkin, but remained holding it, as she saw now, with a brown gloved hand, and looking at her from behind his dark glasses. "Leave the hat," he said, through the white cloth. She began to feel less afraid. She put the hat on the chair again by the fire. "I didn't know, sir," she began, "that—" and she stopped. "Thank you," he said shortly, looking from her to the door, and then at her again. "I'll have it nicely dried, sir, at once," she said, and carried his coat out of the room. She looked at his bandaged head and dark glasses again as she was going out of the door, but he was still holding his napkin in front of his face. She was shaking a little as she closed the door behind her. "My goodness," she whispered. She went straight to the kitchen, and did not even think of asking Milly what she was doing now. The visitors sat and listened to her footsteps. He looked out of the window before he removed his napkin from his face and began his meal again. He took a mouthful, looked again at the window, then rose and, taking the napkin in his hand, walked across the room and pulled down the blind. This darkened the room. He returned more happily to the table and his meal. "The poor man's had an accident, or an operation or something," said Mrs. Hall. "What a shock those bandages gave me." She put some more coal on the fire and hung the traveller's coat to dry. "And the glasses! Why, he doesn't look human at all. And holding that napkin over his mouth all the time, talking through it. Perhaps his mouth was hurt too." She turned round, suddenly remembering something. "Oh dear," she said. "Haven't you done those potatoes yet, Milly?" When Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must also have been damaged in an accident was strengthened, for though he was smoking a pipe, all the time that she was in the room, he kept the lower part of his face covered. He sat in the corner with his back to the window, and spoke now, having eaten and drunk, and being comfortably warmed through, less impatiently than before. The light of the fire shone red in his glasses. "I have some boxes," he said, "at Bramblehurst Station. How can they be brought here?" Mrs. Hall answered his question, and then said, "It's a steep road by the hill, sir. That's where a carriage was turned over, a year ago or more. A gentleman was killed. Accidents, sir, happen in a moment, don't they?" "They do." "But people take long enough to get well, sir, don't they? There was my sister's son, Tom, who cut his arm with a scythe. He fell on it out in the fields. He was 3 months tied up, sir. You'd hardly believe it. I've been afraid of scythes ever since, sir." "I can quite understand that," said the visitor. "We were afraid that he'd have to have an operation, he was so bad, sir." The visitor laughed suddenly. "Was he?" "He was, sir, and it wasn't funny for those who had to nurse him as I did, my sister being so busy with her little ones. There were bandages to do, sir, and bandages to undo, so that, if I may say, sir—" "Will you get me some matches?" said the visitor quite suddenly. "My pipe is out." Mrs. Hall stopped. It was certainly rude of him after she had told him so much, but she remembered the £2 and went for the matches. "Thanks," he said shortly, as she put them down, and turned his back upon her and looked out of the window again. Clearly, he did not like talking about bandages. The visitor remained in the room until 4 o'clock, without giving Mrs. Hall an excuse for a visit. He was very quiet during that time. Perhaps he sat in the growing darkness smoking by the firelight, Perhaps he slept. Once or twice a listener might have heard him. For 5 minutes he could be heard walking up and down the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then he sat down again in the armchair. Chapter 2. Mr. Henfrey has a shock. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark, and Mrs. Hall was trying to find the courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would like some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock-mender, came into the bar.
"Good evening, Mrs. Hall," said he. "This is terrible snowy weather for thin boots."
Mrs. Hall agreed, and then noticed he had his bag with him.
"Now you're here, Mr. Teddy," said she, "I'd be glad if you'd look at the old clock. It's going, and it strikes loud and clear, but the hour hand does nothing except point to 6.
And, leading the way, she went across to the parlour door and knocked. As she opened the door, she saw her visitor seated in the armchair in front of the fire, asleep, it seemed, with his bandaged head leaning on one side. The only light in the room was from the fire. Everything seemed hidden in shadows. But for a second it seemed to her that the man she was looking at had a great, wide-open mouth, a mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower part of his face. It was too ugly to believe. The white head, the staring glasses, and then a great hole. He moved, sat up straight, and put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with a napkin held to his face, just as she had seen him hold it before. The shadows, she thought, had tricked her.
"Would you mind, sir, if this man came to look at the clock, sir?" she said.
"Look at the clock?" he said, staring round sleepily and speaking over his hand, and then, more fully awake, "Certainly." Mrs. Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and at the door Mr. Teddy Henfrey was met by this bandaged person. He was, he said later, quite shocked. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, staring at him, as Mr. Henfrey said, "Like a fish."
"I hope," said Mr. Henfrey, "that you don't mind."
"Not at all," said the stranger, "though I understood," he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, "that this room was to be mine for my own use."
"I thought, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "you'd like the clock."
"Certainly," said the stranger. "Certainly, but at other times I would like to be left alone." He turned round with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back. "And soon," he said, "when the clock is mended, I think I should like to have some tea, but not until then." Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She did not try to talk this time, when her visitor asked her if she had done anything about his boxes at Bramblehurst. She told him that the carrier could bring them over the next day. "You are certain that is the earliest?" he asked. She was quite sure. "I should explain," he added, "but I was really too cold and tired to do so before, that I am a scientist."
"Indeed, sir,"
said Mrs. Hall respectfully, "and I need things from the boxes for my work."
"Of course, sir."
"My reason for coming to Iping," he went on slowly, "was a desire to be alone. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. Besides my work, an accident—"
"I thought so,"
said Mrs. Hall to herself, "makes it necessary for me to be quiet. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for several hours and lock myself in. Sometimes, now and then, not at present certainly, at such times the least thing, even a stranger coming into the room, gives me great pain. It's important that this should be understood."
"Certainly, sir," said Mrs. Hall. "And if I might ask—"
"That, I think, is all," said the stranger quietly. Mrs. Hall said no more. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire and watched the clock being mended. Mr. Henfrey worked with a lamp close to him, and the green shade threw a bright light onto his hands and onto the frame and wheels, and left the rest of the room in shadow. He took longer than he needed to remove the works, hoping to have some talk with the stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still. So still that it frightened Henfrey. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, grey and shadowy, with a bandaged head and large dark glasses staring straight in front of them. It was so strange to Henfrey that for a minute they stood staring at each other. Then Henfrey looked down again. He would have liked to say something. Should he say that the weather was very cold for the time of the year? "The weather?" he began. "Why don't you finish and go?" said the stiff figure angrily. "All you've got to do is to fix the hour hand. You're simply wasting time." "Certainly, sir. 1 minute more. I forgot." And Mr. Henfrey finished and left the room. "Really," said Mr. Henfrey to himself, walking down the village street through the falling snow, "a man must mend a clock sometimes, surely. And then, can't a man look at you? Ugly? And yet again, it seems he can't. If you were wanted by the police, you couldn't be more wrapped and bandaged." At the street corner, he saw Hall, who had recently married the lady of the inn. "Hello, Teddy," said Hall as he passed. "You've got a strange visitor," said Teddy. Hall stopped. "What did you say?" he asked. "A strange man is staying at the inn," said Teddy, and he described Mrs. Hall's guest. "It looks strange, doesn't it? I'd like to see a man's face if I had him staying in my house, but women are so foolish with strangers. He's taken your rooms, and he hasn't even given a name." "Is that so?" said Hall rather stupidly.
"Yes," said Teddy, "and he's got a lot of boxes coming tomorrow, so he says." Teddy walked on, easier in his mind. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did at about 9:30, Mr. Hall went into the parlour and looked very hard at the furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't master there. When he went to bed, he told Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's boxes when they came next day. "You mind your own business, Hall," said Mrs. Hall, "and I'll mind mine." But in the middle of the night she woke up dreaming of great white heads that came after her, at the end of long necks and with big black eyes. But, being a sensible woman, she turned over and went to sleep again. Chapter 3. The 1,001 Bottles. That was how, on the 9th day of February, the stranger came to Iping village. Next day, his boxes arrived. There were 2 trunks, indeed such as any man might have, but also there was a box of books, big, fat books, of which some were in handwriting you couldn't read, and 12 or more boxes and cases full of glass bottles, or so it seemed to Hall, as he pulled at the paper packing material. The stranger, covered up in hat, coat and gloves, came out impatiently to meet the carriage, while Hall was talking to Fearinside, the carrier, before helping to bring the boxes in. The stranger did not notice Fearinside's dog, who was smelling at Hall's legs. "Come along with those boxes," he said. "I've been waiting long enough." And he came down the steps, as if to pick up the smaller case. As soon as Fearinside's dog caught sight of him, however, he began to growl, and when he ran down the steps, it went straight for his hand. Hall cried out and jumped back, for he was not very brave with dogs, and Fearinside shouted, "Lie down!" and reached for his whip. They saw that the dog's teeth had missed the stranger's hand, heard a kick,
saw the dog jump and bite the stranger's leg, and heard the sound of his trousers tearing. Then Fearenside's whip cut into his dog, who, crying with pain, ran under the wheels of the carriage. It was all done in a quick half-minute. No one spoke. Everyone shouted. The stranger looked at his torn glove and at his leg, then turned and ran up the steps into the inn. They heard him go across the passage and up the stairs to his bedroom. "Come here, you," said Fearenside to his dog, climbing off the carriage with his whip in his hand while the dog watched him through the wheel. "Come here," he repeated. "You'd better." Hall stood staring. "He was bitten," he said. "I'd better go and see him." And he went to find the stranger. He met his wife in the passage. "The carrier's dog bit him," he told her. He went straight upstairs, pushed open the stranger's door, and went in. The blind was down and the room dark. He caught sight of a strange thing, a handless arm that seemed to be waving towards him, and a face of 3 large dark spots on white. Then he was struck in the chest and thrown out of the room, and the door was shut in his face and locked. All this happened so fast that it gave him no time to see anything clearly. A waving of shapes, a blow, and a noise like a gun. There he stood in the dark little passage, wondering what he had seen. After a few minutes, he came back to the little group that had formed outside the inn. There was Fearenside telling the story all over again for the second time. There was Mrs. Hall saying his dog had no right to bite her guests. There was Huckster, the shopkeeper, from over the road, asking questions. Sandy Wadgers, looking serious, and women and children all talking. Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it hard to believe that he had seen anything very strange happen upstairs. "He wants no help, he says," he said in answer to his wife's question. "We'd better take his luggage in." "He ought to have his leg looked at immediately," said Mr. Huckster. "I'd shoot the dog, that's what I'd do," said a lady in the group. Suddenly the dog began growling again. "Come along!" cried an angry voice in the doorway, and there stood the stranger, with his coat collar turned up and the edge of his hat bent down. "The sooner you get those things in, the better I'll be pleased." His trousers and gloves had been changed. "Were you hurt, sir?" said Fearenside. "I'm very sorry the dog—" "Not at all," said the stranger. "It didn't even break the skin. Hurry up with those things." As soon as the first box was carried into the parlour, the stranger began to unpack it eagerly, and from it he brought out bottles, little fat bottles, small thin bottles, blue bottles, bottles with round bodies and thin necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, wine bottles, 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 and put them in rows on the table under the window, round the floor, on the shelf, everywhere. Case after case was full of bottles. He emptied 6 of the cases and piled the packing material high on the floor and table. As soon as the cases were empty, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the paper, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, or the boxes and other things that had gone upstairs. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner into him, he did not hear her until she had cleared away most of the paper and had put the food on the table. Then he half turned his head, and turned it away again. But she saw he had taken off his glasses. They were beside him on the table, and he seemed to her to have no eyes. He put on his glasses again, and then turned and faced her. She was about to complain about the paper on the floor, but he spoke first. "I wish you wouldn't come in without knocking," he said angrily as usual. "I knocked, but in my work I cannot have any— I must ask you." "Certainly, sir.
You can turn the key if you want to, you know, any time.
A very good idea, said the stranger.
This paper, sir, if I might say—
Don't. If the paper is a problem, put it on the bill. He was so strange, standing there, with his bottles and his bad temper, that Mrs. Hall was quite afraid. But she was a strong-minded woman.
Then I should like to know, sir, what you consider—
A shilling. Put a shilling on my bill. Surely a shilling's enough.
Very well, said Mrs. Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. If you're satisfied, of course.
He turned his back on her and sat down. All afternoon he worked with the door locked and almost in silence. But once there was a noise of bottles ringing together, as though the table had been hit, and the crash of glass thrown down. And then came the sound of quick walking up and down the room. Fearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened, not wanting to knock.
"I can't go on," he was shouting. "I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000. It may take me all my life. Patience. Patience, indeed. Fool! Fool!"
There was a noise of boots on the brick floor of the bar, and Mrs. Hall could not stay to hear any more. When she returned, the room was silent again, except for the faint sound of his chair, and now and then of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had returned to his work. Later, when she took in his tea, she saw broken glass in the corner of the room. She pointed at it. "Put it on the bill," he said. "In God's name, don't worry me. If there's damage done, put it on the bill." And he went on with his writing.
"I tell you something,"
said Fearinside. It was late in the afternoon, and they were in a little inn outside Iping.
"Well,"
said Teddy Henfrey.
"this man you're speaking of, that my dog bit, well, he's black. At least his legs are. I saw through the tear in his trousers and the tear in his glove. You'd have expected a sort of pink to show, wouldn't you? Well, there was just blackness. I tell you, he's as black as my hat."
"Good heavens," said Henfrey. "It's a very strange case indeed. Why, his nose is as pink as paint."
"That's true," said Fearinside. "I know that. And I tell you what I'm thinking. That man's black here and white there, in pieces, and he daren't show it. He's a kind of half-breed. I've heard of such things before, and it's common with horses, as anyone can see."